There's a strange paradox about religion. It tells you that truth is sacred, but then forbids you from asking questions about it. It glorifies knowledge in its stories, yet punishes curiosity in its pews. Somehow, thinking for yourself became the most suspicious act of all, a quiet rebellion against the divine hierarchy. The church says it wants your soul, but what it really wants is your certainty. Souls are unpredictable. They feel, they doubt, they evolve. Certainty, on the other hand, is obedient. It doesn't argue, it kneels. It repeats what it's told and calls that virtue. You can tell a lot about an institution by the type of people it rewards. The church rewards humility, submission, faith. In other words, the traits most useful for maintaining order, not discovering truth. The ones who ask why are labeled as troublemakers. The ones who say yes are called the faithful. The hierarchy depends on that imbalance, the few who speak and the many who listen. In the medieval world, thinking was a luxury reserved for the clergy, the divine bureaucrats. Ordinary people were told that questioning was dangerous, even sinful. The logic was simple. If people start thinking, they might start noticing, and noticing is the first crack in the wall of control. Once you see the trick, the illusion collapses. So religion invented a clever mechanism, fear disguised as reverence. You're not forbidden to think, you're just told that thinking too much leads to doubt, and doubt leads to damnation. It's like being told you can swim anywhere you want as long as you don't touch the water. What makes this manipulation so effective is that it hides behind good intentions. Don't question God, they say, because He loves you. Imagine if a government used the same reasoning. Don't question us because we're protecting you. You'd call that authoritarian. But when a priest says it with a gentle smile, it suddenly sounds holy. Throughout history, every attempt to think beyond doctrine has been treated as rebellion. Giordano Bruno thought beyond it. He was burned alive. Galileo thought beyond it. He was forced to recant under threat of torture. These weren't criminals, they were thinkers. And thinking, apparently, is the church's greatest crime. It's fascinating how an institution that preaches humility becomes enraged when you stop kneeling. As they say, pride is a sin, but they take immense pride in being right. They warn against idols, yet demand to be worshipped as the only path to truth. There's a certain poetry in that contradiction, and the shepherd terrified of sheep who start reading maps. The church built its authority on certainty. This book is the truth, they say, because it says so in the book. It's the perfect closed loop, self-referential, self-justifying, immune to challenge. If a scientist used that reasoning, we'd call it circular. When a preacher does it, it's called faith. But here's the real problem. When belief replaces thought, power replaces truth. The church doesn't need thinkers because thinkers are unpredictable. They might reinterpret the text, question the morality, notice the inconsistencies. They might ask why an all-loving deity behaves like a jealous monarch, why salvation is always sold through fear, why the truth always seems to need protection from questions. Thinking threatens the system because it turns followers into individuals. And individuals are hard to control. You can command a crowd. You can't command a mind. And that's the uncomfortable truth. Religion survives not because it answers questions, but because it prevents people from asking the right ones. There's an old saying that power corrupts. But in religion, power sanctifies itself. It declares its own corruption holy. Don't question the priest, they say. He speaks for God. But how convenient that God only ever seems to speak in ways that keep the priest in charge. Faith, in this sense, becomes the ultimate currency. The more you surrender, the more righteous you're told you are. You hand over your doubts, your autonomy, your curiosity, and in return, you receive belonging, a family of fellow believers who will love you as long as you keep repeating the script. But that's the secret price. Belonging is rented, not earned. The moment you think differently, the warmth turns cold. Love becomes conditional. Acceptance evaporates. You're no longer one of them. You're one of those. Even the exile of the mind begins not when you're cast out, but when you realize you've been pretending to belong, and yet there's something deeply human about this need to follow. The church didn't invent it. It just learned how to monetize it. People crave certainty the way a child craves a parent's reassurance. The universe is terrifying, vast, indifferent, unpredictable. The idea that someone somewhere has it all figured out, that's comforting. Religion capitalized on that psychological vulnerability. It offers emotional security disguised as spiritual truth. That's why the church doesn't want thinkers. Thinkers dismantle illusions. They strip away comfort to find reality. And reality, without the safety net of divine supervision, can feel unbearably empty. But that emptiness, that silence, is the birthplace of genuine understanding. The great irony is that the church preaches about light while keeping its followers in darkness, warning that too much illumination will blind them. But blindness is exactly what keeps the lights on. In every cathedral, every doctrine, every unquestioned sermon. It's not malice that sustains the system, it's fear. Fear of chaos, fear of insignificance, fear of being wrong. The church simply turned that fear into architecture, into ritual, into scripture, wrapping it in incense and calling it truth. You can almost admire the craftsmanship if you strip away the stained glass, the robes, the hymns. What's left is an old, brilliant design for controlling uncertainty. People don't just follow religion because they're naive. They follow because it gives structure to chaos. The church figured out early that human beings will do almost anything to avoid the discomfort of not knowing. So it offered an elegant trade, certainty in exchange for obedience. You give up your right to question, and in return, you get meaning. You surrender your freedom to doubt, and you get peace of mind. It's a psychological contract written not in ink, but in fear. The structure of belief works like an invisible pyramid. At the top sits divine authority, unreachable, unquestionable, conveniently silent. Below it, the clergy, claiming to interpret its will. Below them, the believers, told that obedience is holiness and curiosity is pride. Every layer depends on the one above, and fears the one below might start thinking. That's why religions build rituals around repetition. It's not about worship, it's about reinforcement, reciting prayers, singing hymns, kneeling on cue. These are not spontaneous acts of devotion, they're neurological conditioning. Each ritual repeats a message until it bypasses logic and lodges itself in emotion. The goal isn't understanding, it's synchronization. That's how obedience becomes identity. When you do something often enough, it stops being an action and becomes who you are. And once faith is tied to identity, challenging belief feels like an attack on the self. People will defend their religion not because it makes sense, but because it's welded to their sense of belonging. You can see this in conversation. Ask a believer a simple question, and something harmless, like, why would an all-powerful being need praise? Watch how quickly the tone shifts from calm to defensive. It's not that they have no answer, it's that they've never been allowed to even form one. The church trains the mind to equate doubt with betrayal, curiosity with danger. The same mechanism that keeps a cult alive is what keeps faith unexamined. Religion's genius lies in turning obedience into virtue. The obedient are not only accepted, they're celebrated. Submission is framed as humility, silence as wisdom, and ignorance as innocence. It's the perfect moral alchemy. When you can make people proud of not thinking, you can make them do anything. Consider the language itself. Sheep, flock, shepherd. These are not metaphors of empowerment. They are symbols of dependence. The church could have chosen any animal, eagles, lions, wolves, but it chose the one that cannot survive without being led. That choice wasn't poetic, it was strategic. And the shepherd, he doesn't fear wolves half as much as he fears sheep who start wondering why they need him. It's fascinating how the same institution that condemns pride as a sin built entire empires out of moral superiority. Missionaries didn't cross oceans because they were humble. They did it because they believed they knew better. They saw foreign cultures as broken and themselves as chosen. It's one of the great ironies of history, humility spreading itself with conquest. Even today, religion thrives on the psychology of dependence. It says you are broken and can't fix yourself. It says the world is fallen and only it can lift you. It says you are lost, and it alone knows the way. It creates the wound, then sells the cure. It's a perfect feedback loop of fear and relief. When you examine sermons, confessionals, or even the architecture of churches, you start to see how everything is designed to make you feel small. The ceilings are impossibly high, the echoes vast, the lighting divine. You are physically dwarfed by the environment, a subtle reminder of your place in the cosmic hierarchy. It's awe turned into submission. Now, awe is not the enemy. Wonder is beautiful. The problem begins when wonder is weaponized, when the unknown becomes a tool for control rather than curiosity. The church doesn't encourage wonder, it monopolizes it. It defines what you're allowed to marvel at and what you must never question. You may gaze at the stars, it says, but remember who made them and who tells you that he did. It's this monopoly on mystery that keeps people dependent. The church insists that you can't understand the divine without it. That spiritual truth must be mediated through its rituals, its language, its hierarchy. It's like a middleman who convinces you that you can't breathe without paying for air. The irony is that most religious teachings began as attempts to understand the world. Ancient stories were early philosophy, humanity trying to make sense of existence before science could. But somewhere along the way, the storytellers realized that explaining the mystery was less profitable than controlling it. And so religion evolved not as a quest for truth, but as an empire of comfort. It teaches people what to think, not how to think. It rewards conformity, not clarity, because clarity has consequences. Once you see the strings, you stop dancing. But obedience isn't just enforced through fear. It's sustained through community. Humans are social creatures. Belonging is our deepest need. Religion exploits that instinct brilliantly. It says, believe and you will be loved. Doubt and you will be alone. Few prisons are lonelier than the one built from rejection. That's why ex-believers describe their departure not as liberation, but as grief. You don't just lose a belief system, you lose your tribe. You lose Sunday mornings, shared rituals, the illusion of eternal company. It's a kind of psychological exile, the cost of reclaiming your mind. And yet, despite all this, the church continues to grow. Not because its ideas are getting stronger, but because its emotional marketing remains unmatched. Fear, guilt, belonging, these are timeless currencies. Logic changes minds, but emotion moves masses. The church mastered emotion long before psychology gave it a name. Think of confession, an ancient therapy without the freedom. You reveal your secrets, but not to heal, to be forgiven. The system gives you temporary relief while ensuring you'll come back. It's spiritual subscription, renewal through guilt and prayer. It's marketed as dialogue, but it's really monologue. People whisper their pain into silence, mistaking their own echoes for divine response. There's something both tragic and poetic in that, the human need to be heard, even by nothing. But perhaps the most ingenious trick of all is how the church disguises obedience as choice. It tells you that you're free to choose, but all options lead back to faith. Doubt is part of the path, they say, as long as it ends in belief. It's like being told you can travel anywhere as long as you never leave the island. You start to see why thinkers are dangerous, not because they're rebellious, but because they're contagious. One person asking the right question can infect a whole congregation. And once thought spreads, authority loses its mystique. That's why history's greatest heretics were often its greatest humanists. They loved truth more than approval and paid for it with their lives. The church doesn't fear evil, it fears enlightenment. Evil keeps the system alive and it justifies prayer, confession, penance, but enlightenment makes all of that unnecessary. A thinker needs no mediator between themselves and reality, and that's the one thing the church can't allow. The genius of religion is that it never truly dies, it evolves. Like a parasite that adapts to the immune system, it mutates just enough to survive. Medieval dogma became modern spirituality. The pulpit turned into the podcast. The robes turned into designer suits. The language of damnation softened into self-improvement. But the message stayed the same. You need us. What's remarkable is how the church manages to keep its grip not through logic, but through emotional architecture. It doesn't argue. It envelops. You don't reason your way into faith. You're drawn into it like a story that feels too familiar to resist. A child is told that God loves them unconditionally, but only under certain conditions. It's a contradiction so early learned, it feels natural. That's how obedience begins, as affection disguised as truth. The child learns that love comes from authority, that approval must be earned, and that questioning is a form of disobedience. By the time they grow up, obedience feels like morality itself. This emotional blueprint is carried into adulthood. The church becomes the symbolic parent, and the congregation is children, loyal, dependent, occasionally rebellious, but ultimately obedient. When you've been raised to equate comfort with conformity, thinking becomes not just risky, but rude. That's why religion survives even in educated societies. It doesn't compete with reason, it sidesteps it entirely. It doesn't need to win the argument if it can make you feel guilty for having one. The church has always understood that emotion trumps evidence. Guilt, shame, and love, and those are its holy trinity. And guilt especially is a masterpiece. It's the leash that doesn't need to be held. A believer polices themselves. They confess before anyone accuses. They feel watched even in silence. The church doesn't need guards when the prisoners build their own walls. If you look closely, you'll notice how this system rewards dependence. People are told they're unworthy without grace, helpless without forgiveness, incomplete without faith. It's the spiritual version of selling you water after dehydrating you. You can't question a system that convinces you your doubt is proof of your brokenness. And yet, there's an even subtler form of control, the moral monopoly. The church positions itself as the ultimate arbiter of good and evil. You can be kind, generous, honest, but unless you do it through God, it doesn't count. Morality becomes privatized, branded, trademarked. The implication is clear. Goodness without belief is counterfeit. That's how institutions turn ethics into ownership. They claim virtue itself as property, as if compassion needed permission, and so the cycle continues. Children inherit the fear, adults inherit the guilt, and society inherits the silence. Everyone knows the contradictions, but few dare to speak them aloud. Why? Because religion doesn't just control individuals, it shapes reputations. A skeptic is still tolerated, but a public critic risks social exile. It's not inquisitions anymore, it's reputational execution. In polite conversation, you can question politics, culture, even science. But faith remains the final taboo. Not because it's sacred, but because it's fragile. The louder the defense, the weaker the foundation. Still, faith adapts. When reason grows too strong, religion rebrands. Today, many people say they're spiritual but not religious. It's the same hunger in designer packaging, a desire for meaning without the dogma, but with the same emotional comfort. The church quietly applauds, because whether you kneel in a cathedral or meditate on Instagram, the dependency remains. This is how belief endures, by shape-shifting into whatever form the era demands. Once it ruled through fear of hell. Now it sells hope and self-love. The theology doesn't change, only the marketing. And yet, the one constant through all these centuries is its allergy to thinking. Thinking doesn't destroy belief, it refines it. But religion doesn't want refinement, it wants loyalty, it wants identity. Thinking is dangerous because it introduces shades of gray into a world painted in black and white. And black and white is easier to sell. The modern church learned to mix just enough reason into the rhetoric to appear intelligent, but never enough to threaten its foundation. Sermons quote science now, and selectively, of course. They talk about psychology, even use words like energy and mindfulness. But behind the modern gloss lies the same ancient premise. Truth flows downward from authority to the believer. It's a pyramid disguised as a circle. Every now and then a thinker emerges from within, a theologian, a reformer, a philosopher, trying to reconcile reason and faith. They're praised as visionaries until they push too far. Then they're quietly retired, quoted selectively, turned into slogans instead of threats. The church loves intellectuals as long as they remain ornamental. That's the tragedy of every genuine seeker. The more honestly you search for truth, the further you drift from doctrine. Because truth has no loyalty to institutions. It doesn't kneel, it doesn't tithe, it doesn't need followers. But that realization is terrifying. To think for yourself means standing alone in a universe with no guaranteed meaning. It's the difference between being a child in a protected garden and being an adult in an endless wilderness. The church offers the garden, safe, structured, supervised. Thinking offers the wilderness, vast, silent, and different. Most people choose the garden, and who can blame them? The wilderness is lonely, but here's the paradox. Only in the wilderness do you discover what freedom actually feels like. Only when you stop being told what to think do you realize thinking is not rebellion. It's your birthright. The church frames it as arrogance, but it's simply maturity. It's easy to mistake obedience for peace and faith for purpose, but peace built on ignorance isn't peace, it's sedation. It numbs the pain of uncertainty, but kills the vitality of thought. It's like being in a beautiful dream you're not allowed to wake from, and when you do wake up, it's jarring. The silence of a world without divine instructions can feel unbearable. That's why so many who leave belief systems end up searching for something else to fill the void. Another ideology, another guru, another kind of certainty. The addiction to answers runs deep, but maybe the real act of courage is in finding new answers. It's learning to live without them, to exist in the tension, to make peace with not knowing, to embrace meaning as something we create, not receive. That's the one truth religion can't afford to let you discover, that you don't need it to be good or loved or whole, that morality, compassion, and awe are not borrowed from the divine. They are human and therefore infinitely renewable. The church needs followers, not thinkers, because thinkers remember that the divine doesn't need a spokesperson. They remember that truth is not fragile and meaning is not owned. They remember that reverence without obedience is possible, that you can stand in awe of existence without kneeling before anyone. And once you remember that, the spell breaks. The modern world likes to believe it has outgrown the church. Skyscrapers instead of steeples, algorithms instead of angels, influencers instead of priests. Yet the psychology remains the same. The craving to be led, to be told that someone somewhere knows the truth. The stage has changed, but the script is the same. We're still kneeling, only now before brands, ideologies, or self-proclaimed spiritual mentors who promise clarity in a confusing world. The church may have lost attendance, but it never lost relevance. It simply outsourced itself into culture. This is the quiet genius of belief systems. They evolve faster than disbelief does. Rationality questions, faith adapts. The church doesn't need to win arguments, it only needs to survive them. It does so by changing its face while keeping its spine intact. You can see this adaptation everywhere, in sleek megachurches where sermons sound like TED Talks, in Christian influencers who sell salvation with affiliate codes, in preachers who speak of manifestation instead of miracles. The vocabulary has modernized, but the hierarchy hasn't. The message is still the same. Don't think too hard. Trust the plan. This new religion of comfort thrives precisely because thinking has become exhausting. We live in an era drowning in information, yet starving for meaning. People scroll endlessly through facts, but still feel lost. The church doesn't compete with knowledge, it competes with chaos. And in a chaotic world, obedience feels like peace. That's why the old tactics still work. Guilt is now repackaged as self-improvement. Sin has been rebranded as negativity. Salvation has become personal growth. The words change, but the structure of dependence remains untouched. Every sermon, every motivational scripture quote still whispers the same message: you are not enough without us. And that's the paradox of religion in modern life. It thrives on the very insecurity it claims to heal. It offers answers to wounds it quietly keeps open. It tells you to love yourself, but only after admitting you're inherently broken. It preaches forgiveness, but never liberation, because liberation doesn't require returning next Sunday. If you look closely, religion's marketing strategy is psychological precision. It begins with flattery. You are special. Then it inserts the wound, but you are also a sinner. And finally, it sells the cure. Only we can save you. That three-step cycle has been running for millennia, perfectly optimized for the human mind. Because the human mind, for all its brilliance, longs to belong. We are creatures wired for narrative. We want to be part of something bigger. Religion offers a cosmic story with you at the center. Loved, chosen, watched. It's intoxicating. Who wouldn't want that? The alternative, A vast and different universe feels unbearable. And so people cling to the story, not because it's true, but because it's comforting. Truth rarely comforts. Comfort rarely tells the truth. But every comfort comes with a cost. To remain inside the illusion, you must silence the part of yourself that asks inconvenient questions. You must pretend certainty feels like peace instead of paralysis. You must confuse devotion with dependency. The church calls that faith, but really, it's a kind of intellectual amnesia, forgetting the world was once full of questions you weren't afraid to ask. What's even more fascinating is how religion disguises obedience as freedom. You are free, it says, as long as you obey. You are loved, it adds, as long as you believe. It's a velvet cage, beautiful, comforting, and locked from the inside. People often defend their faith not by proving it, but by declaring it beyond proof. It's not meant to be understood, they say, which is convenient, because if something can't be understood, it can never be refuted. It's the intellectual equivalent of hiding behind fog and calling it mystery. And yet, mystery is not the enemy. The problem isn't that the church reveres mystery, it's that it monopolizes it. It tells you that awe belongs only to the faithful, that wonder requires worship. But wonder is older than any religion. It was there when the first human looked at the stars and didn't know what they were, and instead of fearing them, simply stared. Religion didn't invent awe. It just started charging admission. The church fears thinkers because thinkers rediscover awe without intermediaries. They realize that the universe doesn't need to revolve around human importance to be meaningful. Meaning doesn't have to be cosmic. It can be created quietly, personally, without permission. And once you discover that, control evaporates. No priest, no doctrine, no sacred book can claim ownership of your soul when you understand that the sacred isn't owned at all. It exists wherever consciousness and curiosity meet. That realization is liberating and dangerous. Dangerous because it dismantles the hierarchy. The moment people stop believing they're broken, the church loses its power. The moment they see that morality doesn't need religion, obedience becomes optional. But liberation always comes at a price. The freedom to think is also the freedom to be uncertain. The freedom to see is also the freedom to be disillusioned. And that's the hardest truth of all. Thinking will not always make you happier, but it will make you real. The church offers certainty because certainty sells better than truth. Truth is messy, slow, unpredictable. Certainty is polished, immediate, and emotionally addictive. It's the fast food of meaning, comforting, familiar, and nutritionally hollow. The real revolution begins when people realize that comfort is not the same as peace. Peace doesn't come from submission. It comes from clarity, and clarity only arrives when you stop outsourcing your mind. The church needs followers because followers maintain the illusion. Thinkers, on the other hand, break it, sometimes gently, sometimes brutally, but always irreversibly. They remind others that doubt isn't a sin, it's a form of honesty, that reverence doesn't require obedience, that love, morality, and beauty don't need divine signatures to exist. In the end, every age must decide what it worships: truth or comfort, thought or obedience, freedom or faith. The church made its choice long ago. The question is, have we? When someone steps away from religion, people often imagine it as a rebellion, a loud, angry rejection of the sacred. But in reality, it's quieter, more like waking up in a familiar room and realizing the walls were never real. You don't destroy faith, you simply stop pretending it answers your questions. What comes next isn't certainty, it's space. The silence left behind is uncomfortable at first. It hums with old fears. What if they were right? What if the world really is meaningless without belief? The mind circles itself, searching for the old walls to lean on, and finds none. That's when the real journey begins. Not away from faith, but toward thought. Because thinking isn't rebellion, it's reconciliation. With reality, with uncertainty, with yourself. It's realizing that meaning doesn't have to be dictated from above. It can be built from within. It's messy, unsteady, sometimes lonely, but it's honest. The church would call that arrogance, but humility Real humility isn't bowing your head to authority. It's admitting you don't know and still daring to look for truth anyway. You start to notice how much of religious life was built on the fear of absence of God, of purpose, of eternal reward. But absence isn't emptiness, it's potential. When you stop expecting someone else to write your purpose, you discover you can write your own. And for the first time, you become the author of your own soul. The church needs followers because followers keep the story static. Thinkers rewrite it. They question the motives of the narrator. They see that holiness and humanity are not enemies, that goodness doesn't need supervision. It's not that religion invented morality, it just privatized it. Compassion existed long before commandments, and curiosity long before scripture. The church framed morality as obedience to protect its relevance, because if people realize goodness is self-sufficient, the entire hierarchy collapses. But morality that requires threat isn't morality. It's compliance. If you need heaven to be kind or hell to behave, your ethics are rented, not owned. True goodness has no audience, and perhaps that's the greatest danger thinkers pose. They reveal that morality, like love, loses its purity when it's motivated by fear. Still, we shouldn't despise those who follow. Faith, after all, is a human impulse, a longing for comfort in a world that often feels too vast to comprehend. It's not stupidity, it's vulnerability. The church merely turned that vulnerability into currency. It's hard to blame people for seeking warmth in the only place they were told it existed, but warmth built on illusion always cools eventually. At some point, the thinking person asks the forbidden question, why must truth need protection? Why must it rely on silence, conformity, ritual, fear? Why does an omnipotent being require flattery? Why does love need conditions? And why does salvation depend on obedience? The moment those questions form, something irreversible happens. You start to see the scaffolding beneath the sacred, the human fingerprints all over the divine. You see how myths were once metaphors and how metaphors hardened into dogma. You see how fear dressed itself as reverence and how control wore the mask of care. It's not cynicism that drives this realization, it's honesty. And honesty, inconveniently, has no loyalty to comfort. The church calls it losing faith. But maybe it's something else, regaining sight. Because to think for yourself isn't to reject the sacred, it's to liberate it from ownership. It's to let wonder be wild again, unregulated, untaxed, unapproved. It's to look at a sunset and feel awe, not obligation. To feel love without theology attached to it. To help another human being, not for reward, but because their pain mirrors your own. That kind of spirituality, raw, personal, unbranded, terrifies institutions. It can't be measured, marketed, or monetized. It exists outside their walls, in the unmediated space between mind and mystery. That's why the church needs followers. Thinkers are too unpredictable. They build their own altars, invisible ones made of curiosity and conscience. They pray not for answers, but for clarity. They kneel not in fear, but in gratitude for the privilege of asking. And once a mind has tasted that freedom, no sermon can make it kneel again. But here's the irony. Even without the church, we still face the same question: how to live meaningfully in a world without guarantees. We trade divine command for human choice, but choice brings its own burdens. Freedom can be dizzying when no one's holding your hand. Yet maybe that's where the beauty lies, in learning to walk without guidance, to stumble and still move forward, to find community not through conformity, but through shared uncertainty, to replace dogma with dialogue, to accept that not knowing isn't a flaw, it's the condition of being alive. In that sense, thinking is the purest form of faith. Faith not in God's, but in our own capacity to seek, to learn, to grow. It's a quieter kind of reverence, one that doesn't demand worship, only attention. So the church will continue to build its walls, polish its doctrines, and collect its followers. But beyond those walls, in the vast silence of honest minds, a different kind of congregation gathers, not united by belief, but by thought. No hymns, no hierarchy, no threats, just minds awake and unafraid. And maybe that's the future, not the death of faith, but its evolution, from obedience to awareness, from submission to understanding, from worship to wonder. Because in the end, thinking doesn't destroy the sacred, it redeems it from its captors. And now, since you've listened all the way here, I'm curious. Where are you listening from? What time is it there? And what's your take on all this? Not as an audience, but as part of the conversation.